Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the Team of Peace community, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks, otherwise known as the best, most innovative, and greatest learning platform in the evaluation and peacebuilding field. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground, based here in Washington, DC. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Michelle Helman, who is going to lead a discussion on monitoring, evaluation, and learning from the inside out. Just a note, if you have a question during the webinar, you can write it on the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the discussion section. I'm now not going to take up any more of your time. I'm going to hand over to today's guest. Michelle, you are very welcome. The floor is all yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Jack, and hello, everybody. It's interesting. I'm sitting here in a room alone by myself, talking into a microphone, but imagining some smiling faces out there. So sending some waves and smiles back at you. So to get started, I'm just going to review the theme for the talk today. So as Jack mentioned, monitoring, evaluation, and learning from the inside out. So participatory evaluation, development, and peacebuilding methods aim to decolonize top-down approaches by integrating inclusive bottom-up practice, which can unintentionally reinforce asymmetrical power dynamics. So in this webinar, I aim to address how applying inside-out evaluation tools and collaborative monitoring, evaluation, learning practice can transform this obstacle into opportunity. So I'll draw from my experience monitoring the 2016 Colombian Peace Accord with the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and some of my own experiences and research on peacebuilding evaluation as a Rotary Peace Fellow. So throughout the talk, I encourage you to examine, engage with, and reimagine your own tools and practice as M&E practitioners. And I'll offer some opportunities for us to explore how together we can co-create definitions of commonly used vocabulary, check our assumptions, and ground theory in lived practice to design and integrate collaborative evaluation tools. As Jack mentioned, we'll have a Q&A at the end of my part of the presentation. And I'll jump in to, sorry if some folks can't hear me. I'm speaking a little louder and having a technical difficulty getting to the next slide, but I sorted it out. Okay, hopefully the sound is all right. So the agenda for today is a little bit more of an intro about me, learning objective overview, co-creating definitions, grounding in human experience, brainstorming tools and practice, potential and future application, and then the Q&A. So I have over 15 years of experience working in the development sector at the intersection of public health, education, and community development and peacebuilding, from working with immigrants and refugees in Portland, Oregon, to working as a small claims court mediator, to leading gap year programs, and currently researching peace and conflict studies at the University of Queensland as a Rotary Peace Fellow. So through all these years of practice working alongside communities, I noticed opportunity to improve communication and collaboration skills, and also a lack in evaluation techniques that were really participatory, collaborative, and inclusive. So in my more current research and practice, I've really been focusing on ways that we can break down these asymmetrical power dynamics and create more inclusive participatory processes for all people involved. A couple disclaimers on my end before we jump to the next point is number one, I'm currently in Australia. It's actually the future. It's April 26th. You're all or folks that are not yet on the 26th or on the 25th, it's way past my bedtime. So I just appreciate any patience as I go through the presentation here. Disclaimer number 2, with the nature of participatory work, I am typically sitting in circles alongside the people that I'm working with. And as I mentioned, I'm not sitting alone staring at my screen. So this is different and a chance for me to learn and adapt. And we'll get to assumptions later, but a quick note on assumptions is I see that there's several people attending and listening. And so we'll consider this us all, the people in the room. And based on your participation here, I'll assume that you have some experience in monitoring and evaluation learning, development work, maybe beginner, maybe intermediate, maybe advanced, maybe no experience at all on the technical side, but knowing that most of this work is actually intuitive, or at least based in a lot of intuition aside from the technical components. So that said, remembering that the learning objective for today is that participants will demonstrate an increased awareness of and the capacity to engage in collaborative monitoring, evaluation, and learning from the inside out. Just keep that in mind as we go through. So next step is co-creating some definitions. The reason this is important is because as practitioners know, the typical methods and mechanisms that we use to do M&E practice are the log frame and theory of change. And these are super important to ensure accountability, particularly to donors. Anybody that's filled out a super long report can attest to that. But they're also based on these linear cause and effect assumptions of A plus B equals C, how change happens, why change happens, and don't often provide opportunity for local and community voices and perspectives and ideas to be integrated and heard. So there's been this bigger push towards participatory M&E. And that's really important because it can account for complexity and uncertainty in the field. It can aim to build relationships, but it's always, also not always easy, as I mentioned, based on requirements from funders and donors, or, for example, in one of my experiences, and we'll get to the definitions here in a moment, monitoring the implementation of the Colombian Peace Accord. So a historical component of this accord is that it was a highly participatory process where community activists, human rights leaders, and other members of the local population were included in the negotiation and the peace process to write this 310-page accord, which is awesome and a huge check the box in terms of participatory practice. But now, post signing of the accord and as we're in the implementation phase, there's actually a systematic assassination and murders happening of these community leaders. So on one hand, it was great. We had to step forward because there was participation, but also that led to unanticipated negative consequences. So just having that in mind and reflecting a little bit on your experiences with evaluation, perhaps with participatory or collaborative evaluation, I'll invite you to think about how you would define each of these three words here: participatory, collaborative, and evaluation. And if you can just think of a couple words or a sentence, feel free to type it into the chat. And then I'll ask Jack to just share one or two of those that sound relevant and or interesting. So I'll take a moment to pause while folks are thinking about that.
Okay, the first one that's come through is from Jindra Sekhan, and Jindra has said local client led. Summer Lewis has written including various perspectives. Brian Chevalier has written brainstorming together. Youssef Al-Mustafa has written participatory involvement. Jeanette Kloosterman has written participatory means with men, boys, women, girls, older and younger people. Fudoma Lama is participatory only when there is power to make changes. And I'm going to name a couple more just because everybody is contributing today. So the last couple I'm going to highlight are Aman Ali Syed, which is context specific. And the final one, and I'll make sure to share some of these, share some more of these during the discussion, is from Charles Goodney, who has written shared ownership.
Awesome. It sounds like there's a plethora of experience in the room, and a lot of awareness and really great ideas. I'm totally on board and have similar definitions myself. So if we were in a typical participatory or collaborative M&E workshop, there would be some big pieces of paper or Post-its, and we would, aggregate this data and share it so we could see it visually together. I'm sure many people are familiar with probably our number one tool as Post-its in many cases. So this is great. Keep that on the back burner, and we'll check in about those later. Another technical, here we go. You're hearing me struggle with my switching from one slide to the next, but it's worked. So let's ground this a little bit more in our experiences with examples, because it's one thing to define a term and to try to get on the same page with what we all mean, which is a really useful first step. And then we want to talk about what does it actually look like. So one of my first experiences with M&E, unbeknownst to me at the time, was when I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Peru way back in 2006. And one of the first activities that I engaged in was called a transect walk. And so this means I basically walked through the community and noted different points of interest that seemed important to me, and that also, by interviewing community members, noting what points of interest were important to them. And so comparing these two lists, I noted that the river was important and that the bus stop was important, but 99% of the community members that I engaged with highlighted the town center, the church, the school, and the health post. So each of our perspectives were valid, but myself as an outsider thinking that something was important, when I took the time to actually ask the local people what was important to them, a whole new story emerged. So this was an aha moment for me as a sort of taking baby steps in development work, but now reflecting back in terms of being an M&E practitioner, it's a tool that can be used to help bring in perspectives that might not be, that are actually what's really happening on the ground rather than assumptions. So I'm actually going to ask again another prompt for all of you to think about and contribute. What are some of your own experiences and tools that you use to engage in participatory practice? And if you're not engaging in participatory practice, what are some ways that you find that you might connect with local people, partners, or stakeholders? So I'll take a couple moments to have people type in and share. And then whenever we're ready, if Jack can just share 5-ish or more of those.
Okay, we've quite a few coming through already. Um,
Excellent.
the first comes from Jeanette Klusterman, who says, use storytelling, make sure to collect from all the players involved. From Youssef Al Mustafa, we try to bring some people from the community to attend the process of designing the tools. Miriam Chikwanda has said theory of change workshops. And then the final one I'll mention is validating the evaluation results on social mapping by Fudoma Lama.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Great. So we'll move on to building upon this. That we all already have the tools and the practice in place. If you don't feel like that's true, hopefully this webinar can help, and there's many more resources out there to start engaging in participatory practice. But the idea really is, how can we reflect and evaluate on our own practice, assumptions, ideas, beliefs, etc., in order to help us become better M&E practitioners. So a little bit of reflection and brainstorming on what works well and what can be improved. And I might switch things up here for a moment, because we've already had a lot of really good ideas in terms of definitions and experiences. And so I'm going to put a lot of those into the what works well category. But let's just, as analysts and researchers and practitioners, acknowledge some of the limitations in the participatory model and just brainstorm a couple ideas of what can be improved, or what are some opportunities to transform those obstacles within the constraints of the work that you're doing and the position that you have. So again, if you can just share a couple ideas, that would be awesome. Has anybody typed in anything?
They're asking, actually, just a couple of people have typed there, if you could repeat the question once more.
Great. Okay, yeah, sorry if that was unclear. So based on our experiences, we know that there's a lot of things that work well, but also within the constraints and confines of our positions, of the reporting that we have to do, of the job assignments that we have, it's not always possible to engage in the extent of participatory M&E that we'd like. So based on those confines and the ideas that you have, what are some things that you would like to improve, or are there any particular components that you think you could focus on to improve? And we'll build on this later. It's a little bit more clear as mud.
I think that should work. Okay, the first answer coming through is Summer Lewis. Make the data useful for the organization versus being donor driven. The second comes from Jindra Sekan, who said participatory design and funding to begin with. The next comes from Laura Diamond, who says communication, knowing the local languages and customs around communication. And Aman Ali Sayed, this will be my final one, is standardized definitions across the sector.
Awesome. Definitely. So getting a little bit more complex here, and seeing that while we're all motivated and have the skills, there's definitely things in and out of our control. And given the aims of this workshop, we're going to focus on the things that are in our control to change. So this includes checking our own assumptions. So the parable of the elephant that some of you may have heard is that there are 6 blind people that are brought in a circle around an elephant and asked to touch the elephant and then explain what they feel. And so one person feels the trunk and says, oh, this animal, this is gigantic snake. And another person touches one of the legs and says, this animal is as tall as a giant tree, etc., etc. And this story can help explain how what's actually Einstein's theory of simultaneity, where different people are experiencing the same thing, but in different ways. So what you or I might think is real might be different than what somebody else thinks is real, or how they experience the same situation when I mentioned my transect walk experience. So to get around this, the magic question is why, and asking why is that important to you? And then engaging one of my favorite metaphors, not metaphor, acronym, WAIT, W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? So this is really important after you ask that magic question, why, is to engage in active listening, which is basically, are you waiting for your turn to talk, or are you actually listening to the answers that the people are generating? Also keeping an eye out for what is the community already doing, checking for some positive deviance, for example, instead of assuming what should happen or what needs to be done, and giving some space for what is already happening to emerge. Some alternatives and ethics to consider. What are other ways of knowing an expression? Is it art, music, spiritual practice? Can any of this be used as data? And if we do choose to look at it that way, is there an ethical way to utilize that data in a way that can also benefit the community, to make sure that we're not appropriating information and reinforcing some of those power dynamics? So keeping that in mind and moving forward, as our time is moving forward as well, takeaways and potential. So in order to create change, which I think most of us are in it to win it, we want to create some social change, and we're developing projects and frameworks and evaluating that as tools to help us along the way. Post-its, other tools, other frameworks, but really in terms of creating that change. And one of the takeaways of this workshop is that reflective practice that's adaptive and iterative, where change really does come from within. And at the risk of sounding like a self-help book, at least just giving some space to evaluate our own practice, because that's really what we have control over. So let's think back to some of the answers that you all shared when we were talking about definitions, from local client-led brainstorming and involvement to some examples of storytelling, social mapping, and even room for improvement with communicating and making data useful. So thinking about, in terms of future application, what's one step you can take to address what's not working well, and another step you can take to continue what is going well? So I'll reframe. Thinking of what we've covered so far, what is one action step you can take this week, to apply some of this information and move forward to create some collaborative M&E practice? So what does that look like for you moving forward? And please share.
I think our audience are a little bit keyboard shy right now, but they're coming through. So I'm just going to read out two to keep us going. First is from Fedoma Lama, which is ongoing evaluation that is critical and effective and reflective, but I'm sure also effective. And Janelle Frail, who said, I can set up one-on-one meetings or group meetings for evaluations.
Awesome. So I'll just give maybe one more reframe. Let's see here. In order to promote participatory evaluation methods and aim for more collaborative work alongside the local communities that we are serving and or a part of, where are there some obstacles, and are there ways that you can approach those with a new perspective, whether it's by checking your assumptions, whether it's applying an old tool in a new way, whether it's learning about a new tool that might be contextually specific, any ideas that pop up as you reflect on what participatory M&E and collaboration looks like for you. And if no ideas come to mind, no worries, but just in case, we can take one or two more here. Because again, it's one thing. Oh, you've got it. Awesome.
Yeah, we just have one more added on here is from Sarah Juliax, who said, reviewing the theory of change with key stakeholders.
Excellent. Thank you.
And one that we missed earlier, but I think is quite interesting, is from Kate Monkhouse, who writes, we are an international network of volunteers. It is a huge challenge for us to create priority for evaluation via WhatsApp, Skype, etc. We are also realizing issues of confidence and literacy for submitting data.
Yeah, that can certainly be a challenge when we need to use words and numbers with technological devices, which is why I love storyboards, but not always accessible. Great, thank you for sharing, everybody. So we're actually wrapping up the presentation here. And if there are, before we get to the Q&A, so where I'll do my best to answer questions in case anybody needs to leave early, just sharing my contact information with you here and encouraging to stay in touch as a way to create community and share ideas and support and inspire each other. So I'll hand it over to Jack to facilitate the Q&A and look forward to some discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you to a very engaged audience today. While we always have a ton of questions, that regular engagement throughout is definitely new to the Thursday Talks, so thank you, Michelle, for bringing the best out of our audience and for a great presentation. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, you can submit your question in one of two ways. The first is to do what you've been doing and type it through the question function. The second is to click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask you to submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Pieces Media Gallery, so those who are not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. Okay, so we have a couple of questions I think have already come through. The first comes from Brian Chevalier. And Brian writes, can you talk about some of the barriers you've come up against when attempting participatory evaluation?
Sure. So some of the barriers that I've come up against when trying to incorporate or enact a participatory evaluation. So getting people to show up is a barrier. In a few different contexts in Peru and Nicaragua where I've worked, and then in the US as well, in the community development sector, what does it take to nudge or entice people to show up, to get them to realize that it's worth it for them? And again, this is sort of part of that asymmetrical power dynamic where I'm a program manager or in a position of power with funding, and I'm trying to run a program that's benefiting people. And I think that I have this great idea of something that they'll benefit from, so they should show up. For example, a family night where we share resources about health, access to health care for undocumented immigrant families. So I think this is a great idea. I think it's really useful advocating for healthcare for all, but how do you get that word out? And when you do, for example, what time is that meeting? Is there childcare provided? Is there dinner provided? Are there interpreters for multiple languages? So do the people show up on time if they show up? Do they have public transportation access? Do you need to get them bus passes? So working through all of these complex issues, and then actually when the people do show up, making sure that you or the facilitator is engaged in a way that's doing what I've been hopefully explaining through this webinar of facilitating and holding space that gives people's voices room to be heard and valued, where they can actually lead and take ownership of the process. So that takes a lot of patience and working around the hoops, if not jumping through them sometimes.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Our next question is asked by a number of people, including Fidoma and Amy. Just if you could provide some examples of times when you've used participatory and collaborative monitoring and evaluation practices that have actually resulted in the program being more effective.
Yes, great. What is the impact? One of the biggest, I think, most common questions that we have. So I'll talk a little bit about my my recent work with the Kroc Institute. So I was part of the research team monitoring the implementation of the Accord. But in that time, we noticed some room for improvement in terms of collaborative thinking, teamwork, and trust within the team. There's a lot of people working remotely, people working in different regions and departments of the country, coming together only once in a while, but we're all required to work together in the name of peace, to be aggregating data, writing reports, etc. And so I engaged with the executive leadership of the organization and did an internal needs assessment. And based on interviews and observation that I did, created some participatory experiential education, blanking on the word, excuse me, activities to engage the team in some of their own reflection on assumptions, work styles, bias, definition of terms, etc. And then reviewed the data, created a report, presented that back to leadership and debriefed with them. And the outcome was adjustments and changes to policies and procedures within the organization, from Monday meeting agenda points to job descriptions and transparency and what communication looked like within the organization. So incorporating the people's perspectives and experiences into the research and the report helped make it relevant to them, and it made the change easier to really to happen, if that's not quite the right vocabulary word, but hopefully that's answers the question.
Great, thank you, Michelle. Our next question comes from Summer Lewis, who writes, what top resource or resources would you recommend for learning more about participatory monitoring and evaluation?
Great. Hello, Summer, a familiar name in the crowd here. So some of the top resources that I use are actually shameless promo of the DM&E for Peace website has a ton of resources. I was actually just reading an article today about the most significant change technique and some youth-led video work that actually turned into peace building advocacy. I also, Harvard has a PDIA toolkit that if you or anybody wants to email me, I can share that with you. Just going through my resources list here. IDEO.org has some human-centered design frameworks, and I found extremely easy to use, not technical language with visuals on how to design different types of frameworks. There's a few more that just aren't coming to mind at this moment, but as I said, if anybody wants to email me and be in touch, I'm happy to share more based on what some of your needs and interests are as well.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, thank you for the kind plug, Michelle. So one of a couple of resources I'd recommend is a few years ago, myself and the DME for Peace team at the time led a human-centered design workshop in South Africa with a number of the participants online today. And that was all about breaking barriers to participation and inclusion in peace building evaluation. So if you go to the DME for Peace website, the community section, there's an entire microsite dedicated to breaking barriers in participation and inclusion. So a couple of the interesting things that came out of that were things like co-designing your theory of change based on the snowball sampling methodology. But one of the things I'd like to reiterate over and over again is, like, one of the reasons that DME for Peace is called Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Peace, despite being primarily evaluation platform, is we have to be very intentional about our design. In order for us to make sure that evaluation is inclusive, is effective, is participatory, that needs to start at the design process. So being able to be intentional in what we're designing allows us to think about what a feedback loop looks like, and to sort of anticipate challenges, to challenge our assumptions, to understand what the existing work is and how we can build on that. So yes, I encourage you to check out the Breaking Barriers section of the site. I'm happy to direct people that direction after the webinar. The next question actually feeds on this a little bit more because it's something I hear a lot about the work at DME for Peace. It's from Kate Monkhouse, and Kate writes, what opportunities have you explored for engaging people remotely when time or budget or geography mean that face-to-face is not possible?
Great question, and I think another participant mentioned this in terms of room to improve the challenges in engaging people with technology. So most of my work has actually, fortunately, I suppose, been pretty direct. When people have been more remote, I've taken buses and walked kilometers to knock door to door to invite pregnant teens to a reproductive health support group, for example, door to door, number of weeks, inviting them. If you're sort of expanding that geographical zone even further than buses or some mode of transportation can take, I'm not as familiar with I know that there's some technology that I'm forgetting the technical word for, but the person that mentioned this comment previously might know, where you can survey and get information through mobile phones. So yeah, there might be more expertise in the room than I have regarding how to engage people from a distance, but that's a challenge, and that's where a lot of the work needs to be done, because a lot of times people in rural areas without access or without as much ease and access to communication are the people that we really want to involve. And so something that we did with Kroc Institute is we had regional specialists working in departments, so they could, who are actually members of those communities as well. And so they're 24/7 living with the communities and collecting data, and then once every month or two come to the main office in Bogota and work with the team there. So if you can't get the people to come to you, you go to the people, and hopefully your organization has a budget to send you there, right?
Okay, so the final question we're going to deal with today, and I apologize to everyone that we're not going to get to. There's a ton of questions, and I'll happily share these with Michelle, and she can see if she can reach out or add the answers to the comment section of the DME for Peace recording. But it comes from Tanko Mahamadou, and Tanko writes, "What is the limitation of the participatory approach? Like, why is it hard?"
Yeah. This is a super question, I think, to wrap up with, that will just inspire more thinking and work moving forward. But so M&E is an accountability tool for donors and funders. And as I mentioned, there's this shift towards how can we make more participatory practice to make it relevant and needs-based. The challenge in that, as I think some of the other questions have aimed at, how to get people involved, how to get people to show up. This isn't always worked into budgets or timeframes, when a lot of reports are just a matter of answering the next 18 donor questions about impact and citing, the next 50 sources. And also there's this real and perceived sense of urgency in the field, depending on if you're in a humanitarian context, community development context, fill in the blank, where as many amazing ideas as we have as like motivated, passionate practitioners, we don't always have the wiggle room to say, oh, well, I think we should do a, social theater or theater for social change activity where we get people to be creative and engage about their social issues and identify ways to evaluate with that. No, you have to fill out our report. It's do it to get it in. And so working within the confines of time, space, job description, funding can be difficult.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for a great presentation and for a really engaging question and answer section. And thank you to our audience. I know this is more engaging than you normally are, more engaged than you normally are on a Thursday, but we really appreciate hearing from you and learning from you to help guide this discussion. This recording, I know there's a lot of content, so this recording is going to be posted online later today on the DME for Peace Media Gallery. So please return to it, share it with your colleagues, and please feel free to continue the discussion in your comments. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks' time with another M&E Thursday talk, and we look forward to seeing you online. Thank you, Michelle, again for being a great host. Try to get some sleep, given it is well after your bedtime in Australia. And thank you to the rest of the audience. Have a great rest of your week, and I will talk to you all soon.